Hello, and welcome to Of Significance, the economics and analytics podcast where the only thing we're A/B testing is your patience. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright, here with experienced experts who have been analyzing big data since before it was big. They're pioneers in working from home. It's Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Bronars. Steve, Nathan, how are you today?
I'm a pioneer. I'm doing okay.
I think Steve's further out in the frontier than I am, but I'm also doing okay.
We're all well aware of how the workplace has changed since the pandemic, and with telework more common than before, many are wondering if work from home arrangements reduce productivity and negatively affect profitability. Well, now we have real data from real companies about whether a workplace benefits from remote work or if it's time for companies to return to office. So the data analysis we're looking at today comes out of an A/B testing program done by Trip.com, where employees volunteered to enter this experiment and were selected to be part of a certain number of days working remotely. My first question about this study is, what is so special about the way all this was set up?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think what's special, broadly, we talk a lot about on this podcast and elsewhere about not having data to answer some of the questions that people are asking, and people are relying on their intuition. I think what's really neat about this is it's a unique situation where a company had the ability to go out, gather data, set up an experiment, gather the data kind of in a systematic, rigorous way, test hypotheses, and do it not only kind of for their own benefit, but also they shared it and they put it in a peer-reviewed publication, and they put their data out there. And so whatever their conclusions are, like them or not, they're showing their work. And I think that's a pretty unique situation where we don't see people actually analyzing the data to answer some of these questions.
So how many people did they include in this study, and how are they selected?
I think it was over 1,200 people, and you had to volunteer to be part of this. They're mostly in computer science, accounting, finance, fields like that. Once you were willing to participate, they randomized based, I think, on your birth date, whether you were in the group that could work a hybrid schedule and work remotely or not. And so, obviously they gave some information about the characteristics of the workers. Most of them are in their 30s, so they're very young, in my opinion. But they are, and they're in certain fields, and this is a workplace in China. And so, one of the questions would be, as important as this is for this particular workplace, how much could you extrapolate from this study to draw inferences about what might happen if this were an option, the hybrid schedule were option in other workplaces around the world? But yeah, I think the interesting thing, this is a study that's been co-authored by a professor at Stanford, Nicholas Bloom, has written a lot on work from home, probably more than any other economist. And this is a study that he and colleagues put together, and to really get this kind of experimental or close to being experimental data rather than just observational data.
Right. And so for context, Trip.com has something like 40,000 employees in total. I think it was 1,600 as opposed to 1,200 that were involved in this study.
400 managers.
Yeah. Okay. Do you count them as working, really?
Yeah, really.
So what were the major conclusions of this? What could we take away from it?
Well, there were a bunch of different conclusions, and I think kind of at a very high level, to start with, they interviewed managers in advance and said, well, what do you think? What do you think about this? And they tended to say, this is not going to be a good plan if we're going to keep workers productive. And by the end of the experiment, they had switched and were marginally positive in terms of their reaction. So on some very, very high level, I thought it was really interesting that the managers who they surveyed in advance said, this is not going to be good for us. And by the end of the experiment, it said, you know what, this is going to be just fine. Steve, you want to talk a little bit about some of the other outcomes?
Yes. I think one of the things that's probably the easiest to try to measure would be the turnover rates. And there was an improvement in terms of reducing turnover for the group that was able to work on a hybrid schedule and work remotely. And so there was a significant decline in the exit rate of those workers. And this study was done a few years ago and following up the data. So that is a very positive outcome in terms of worker retention. And then the other thing they were looking at was the productivity of the workers, which again could be in some companies, a more difficult thing to come up with a single measure across all the different types of workers who are going to be in your workplace to measure what happened to their productivity. And they had good productivity measures. And I think they were finding that there wasn't really a drop off in productivity. It wasn't necessarily productivity enhancing, but there was not the decline in productivity that Nathan was talking about that some of the managers were worried could happen.
Right. So we saw a 35% lower attrition among the population that was allowed to work from home. That to me seems like a very shocking difference, at least as far as I would expect there's be some boost to morale, but that it's this kind of operational benefit as opposed to workers being better in some way, I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I think that, in the US, the turnover rates are pretty high, especially in certain types of businesses. And so one of the keys to being a more efficient, profitable organization could be to reduce turnover. I'm not as familiar with what the turnover rates are in China in general, so I don't know if this was a high turnover type business or low turnover type business, but turnover is definitely an issue in U.S. companies, especially for certain workers of particular demographic groups that, there's the cost of having to train and bring on board replacement workers when people turn over. So that could definitely be something that benefits the company if you can manage turnover.
Yeah, and I think, one of the nice things about it, there is the experimental part of this. There's survey part of it. They're comparing people who are participated in the program and were randomly assigned with people that were also at Trip.com, but were not included in the experiment in other business divisions or in the same divisions, but before the experiment was underway. And so they looked at it a lot of different ways, and kind of across the board, the job satisfaction numbers were up. So it's not just kind of the retention that you could see in the data who's terminated, but the actual, reported job satisfaction of the people that were working from home was up compared to everybody else. So I don't think, it's retention, hanging on to people, great. And then the people that are sticking around are feeling better about it.
Well, Steve, one of the things you pointed out was comparing this data to what might go on in US markets. And because your analysis population is set in China, there might be cultural differences in the way that people view work and work remotely that might affect, the actual outcome of the study. But are there any other major parts of the way that this was approached that you might think there's probably some things that we need to take with a grain of salt?
Well, I think that, one thing I talked about before was the kind of job that you're engaged in and how feasible it is for you to do your job well if you're working remotely. There's the benefit on the worker side of not having to commute. So I could see, depending on what the commuting times in some metro areas where people have long commutes in and out of work, it could really benefit. But those are the kind of things that you would need to look at on a case by case basis. And again, they got this company to agree to do this in this particular location and these jobs. But I think the one thing to be very cautious about is whether or not you could extrapolate this to another workplace and people doing all sorts of different kinds of jobs that might not be falling into the same categories as the workers that were in this study.
The only thing I'd add to that in terms of things that, I took with a grain of salt when I was reading the article is I think productivity is measured by lines of code that were written. And just speaking for myself from back when I was writing lines of code, I'm pretty sure more lines of code sometimes is less productive than fewer lines of code. So obviously I'm
copy paste, no looping, copy paste.
I don't mean to pick too much, coming up with productivity measures that actually, are analyzable and capture what you want them to capture is really, really hard. So I think this is worth trying. I don't know if that's the best measure of productivity. The fact that they found no significant difference could be that measure is not particularly useful.
And I think the difficulty too is, Nathan, I agree with that as you go to workers in different types of jobs, even if you had a good measure for one of the jobs, there are going to be people in the workplace that are doing different kinds of jobs. Is the quality of the measure that you have the same across the different types of jobs, or is it a better proxy for productivity in some jobs and not as good of a proxy in others? So I think that's why I look at more at the turnover and the satisfaction, where that seems like it's a little bit easier to measure than some of these productivity measures that may or not have some noise involved.
And I think, they had, I don't think we mentioned this earlier, but they had performance rates were unaffected, promotion rates unaffected. So it's not just retention, although I think the retention one is the one that popped out the most to us because, as Brent pointed out, it's a gigantic difference at 33% or a third or whatever it was.
What do you guys think of the fact that you have to volunteer to be in this population? Does that affect in any way how you interpret these results?
Yeah. I mean,
I guess, for example, I wonder, in a way, there's not really a placebo group, because I know whether or not I'm a 5 workday person or I'm working remotely 3 days of the week or working remotely 2 days of the week. And I might be dissatisfied having joined the study, and I'm kind of penalized by having the work in office every day.
Yeah. And I think that's right within the people who were part of the experiment and were selected for the one group versus the other. The authors are a little bit worried about this, and I give them some credit because they are comparing also to the period before the experiment and to other divisions not subject to the experiment in terms of their comparison, for example, of the retention rates. But yeah, I mean, I always worth considering. Do I think it sort of undermines the overall conclusion of the paper? No, but I think it kind of goes broadly to the point, that Steve's making as well, that how well that result would replicate in somebody else's particular environment is going to depend a lot on, local factors specific to that firm and geography and the local labor market otherwise. Because, if you can go work for somebody else and get a hybrid work environment, maybe you would be more likely to leave no matter what, even if this experiment's working out for the people that were able to get into that couple days from home.
I think that we're, very positive about this study. I think it's gotten some press and it's very interesting. And I think this is like The Economist being a naysayer about all sorts of things. We say we don't have experimental data, we have observational data. Then you try to run an experiment, then we pick holes with it wasn't really like you could force people to participate who don't want to. And
that's why it's called the dismal science.
That's right.
It's always negative.
So compared to a situation in which you'd be looking at company A where they allow hybrid schedules and remote work, and company B where they don't, and trying to make those kind of comparisons, I definitely think this is more informative. Is it perfect? No, but I think in economics and a social science, you're not really going to be able to run the kind of experiments that you can in the so-called hard sciences. So you learn from this, and I do think, as I've said now a couple times, the real issue is, could you generalize from this? You have a treatment effect here of being in, the difference between being in group B and group A, or what things look like the prior year. But how stable is that estimate of the, let's say, decline in turnover rates, that you could project that to some other workplace in some other industry and maybe in some other part of the world? I think that's the question that you'd be the most skeptical of, that we really can learn that much that could be extrapolated.
Right, because there's a lot of people right now are trying to figure out how important is having some work from home a component of people's work-life balance. And if you're a business, you obviously don't want to lose a ton of money. But this kind of indicates to me that there's something of a risk of trying to do work from home and then going back from it. That if you implement this program, you could lose a lot of people who are very interested in keeping that benefit once they have it.
Yeah, well, right. And we come at this from kind of the labor and employment background. And the article does point out that there are differences between, I think, managers and non-managers. There are differences between women and men. um, in terms of how they were affected and how positive they were and what their retention rates were if they were not able to work from home. So yeah, so if you had work from home and you pull it back, that could have differential effects on different parts of your employment population. And maybe, and again, this is the time we probably talk about not being attorneys, but maybe that's the kind of thing that if it did have, if women were more likely to leave than men as a result of going back into the office full time, which is what the article would show, then that might be something that you'd be worried about from a, adverse impact standpoint.
Yeah, I think it would definitely make a big difference for men and women who have children. And I think a pretty high fraction of this workforce did have children. I think it was skewed more towards men in the data for this particular experiment. But those are also very interesting points. And I just think in terms of the different kind of jobs that you might have at the same workplace, some of them may translate better to remote work than others. And so then, the idea that, hey, this is great to be able to work from home, but if it's limited to only certain of the members of the workforce, depending on their jobs and how well that translates, I think that's another issue that managers would be facing.
And another thing, I think, celebrate the study. It's great that they've done it. I kind of wish one thing that was included was we've got a difference in treatment between fully working the office and partial work from home. I'd be quite interested to see what would happen if you had fully remote as being a component of that, if that affected satisfaction even more, or if it really was very targeted as a benefit to people who have kids or people who are married or some other subpopulation that might not be picked up by all the data.
Yeah, and I think you could get into other questions too, like, if you really were fully remote, it's probably a little tougher if you're a brand new employee onboarding in a fully remote environment. We all remember that from the COVID times. And so that would be another point of distinction, that how it works out would be different for the long tenured experienced employee from somebody who is joining for the first time.
And I think that bringing up the COVID years, that really nudged us in a direction, and we're getting more and more data as we start gathering more data about the number of people that work from home or at least working hybrid schedules. And really, it wasn't that long ago where that wasn't a big question that was being asked in the publicly available data sets that are out there describing people's work experiences. So this is an issue that's going to be around as companies has moved in that direction. I think the question is, what are the trade-offs?
So I want to talk about a slightly different analysis that was put forward by a recent New York Times piece, looking at several British companies that are experimenting with a 4-day work week as opposed to a 5-day work week. This is obviously not the same as having some of your workforce be work from home or completely in the office. But they moved to this 4-day model without having any associated pay reductions. What were some of the interesting conclusions of this? And I think one thing to just caveat with all this is that there's not the same level of publicly available detailed data that was provided in it.
Yeah. And I'm glad you made that point. This is not, a set of data that's gone through the vetting process and peer review and everything else. But it's a fascinating article. And I think the top line takeaway was that something more than 90% of the companies that went to this 4-day work week, and just to be clear, it's 4 days of work, but the same pay. And they wanted to stick with it. And they wanted to stick with it. Hard to know all of the reasons why. In the story, the discussion focused on, again, kind of like we were talking about, retention. People were happier and more likely to stick around. It was easier to recruit people to these firms on a 4-day work week for the same pay than if you asked them to do 5 days down the street at some other company. But the kind of remarkable thing that, and again, it's hard to tell because there's not data to review, but according to the people interviewed in the article, at least, there was no diminished productivity. There was no diminished revenue. So somehow people who were happier, maybe they're a little more refreshed, just working the 4 days a week, were able to do the work that they would have otherwise done in 5 days.
There's an issue in, kind of HR literature called the Hawthorne effect, where they changed the environment and they turned up the lights and, hey, people worked harder. And then they dim the lights and go, hey, people worked hard. Any kind of change. And so part of it could be that you realize, hey, we have the possibility of going to a 4-day week. We would like that. We're going to work harder because we want them to approve this. And so whether or not there's truly this effect that the productivity stays the same, or the participants would like to see this happen, and so temporarily during this testing period, they're working harder. It's unclear, right? Because they are responding to incentives and they have desire maybe to say, I would like the company to switch to this. And so the last thing I want to have happen is productivity fall if I'm only working in the office 4 days a week rather than 5.
Yeah, and to that point, the article ends, and I'll just quote it with a quote from one of the people interviewed. There's definitely a big push to succeed and make this our new normal. The people want to work 4 days a week, and so they're going to be anxious to make sure that looks successful to them. How that plays out in the long run, who knows?
Yes, I agree, Nathan, especially during like a testing period. If you know that you're being monitored to see what's happening to your productivity, you may be working harder during that period to live up to expectations more than you would if you didn't know you were being monitored and this whole experimental 4-day work week was being tested.
And I think that's what's so neat about the paper that the folks put out there on the working from home thing, because of that design and because of the contrast pre and post, and within the same period between people randomly selected in the two groups, you can feel a little more confident in what those results are telling you. Whereas here, they didn't do that, obviously, but they also, as far as I know, don't have, a matched similar firm that did not go to a 4-day work week that would be a proper contrast. So time will tell, but it's just a little bit harder to be as confident in these results.
Right. And thinking back to the trip.com type analysis, I wonder if the people who are moving to the partial work from home are trying to be more ambitious. It seems weird to tank your productivity if you're a 5-day work in office type employee. I'm going to work worse because I don't want this to continue.
You talked about it a little bit, Brent, where you said you realize that you're in the group that's not getting the benefit of the hybrid schedule, and you might feel bad about that. And you might, if you're really thinking ahead, going like, hey, if I don't work as hard, it's going to make the other group look relatively better because they're being compared to me. So whatever the motivation is, you have this possibility either because you're bummed out that you signed up for this program and then you got the placebo and you got the placebo, or you're saying, I really want this hybrid work schedule to work. So even though I wasn't assigned to that treatment, I'm going to,
well,
not be as motivated.
That's a troubling takeaway that the group subject to the treatment probably is less productive, but the group that's not subject to the treatment wanted to be less productive. And so they were equally not as productive.
Well, I think it goes back to Brent's earlier point, which is that, presumably when you do a randomized controlled trial and the person gets the pill and they take it, you're not saying, oh, that's a sugar pill. It's not really doing anything for you. Right. Whereas that you're still in the office 5 days a week.
Right.
So I'm not saying that it definitely would have an effect, but it could. Whereas if you are disguising it, you don't really know whether the placebo has that you're getting the placebo or not.
I think the big takeaway from our end is that more companies should do these types of analyses and try to publish their results in some way. Even if the results don't show any significant findings, that is actually going to be very useful for all of us to try and understand what is the most efficient way of organizing our labor force.
But I think you also said telling people they're being experimented on messes up the experiment. So for all you companies out there, go ahead and experiment, but don't tell your employees. Is that the...
Yeah. Let's just get all the companies in on a kind of insane meta-analysis where we tell some companies to treat some of their workers some ways. We just have like an economist's dream. Oh, you're going to get to play with all of society and make whatever rules you want. Let's really test it all. Put the papers to work. Did you have something to say, Steve?
Yeah. The thing that I was going to say is that To follow up on what you were saying, Brent, there is this bias towards publishing results in peer-reviewed journals that have significant findings. But in this case, the absence of a significant finding, whether let's say it had to do with productivity, would be a useful thing to know, assuming you're measuring productivity well. And we talked about some of these issues with it. But that's an important result, that productivity didn't decline, even though you're working 4 days rather than 5, or you're working a hybrid schedule rather than not. So I don't think for these kind of studies, you have to have a significant differential to still come away with it saying we've learned something.
And hey there, StatPack. If you like Of Significance, give us a review, rate us, give us 6 out of 5 stars. Give us impossible values outside of the bounds of our models.
Any real number. Any real number
we would love as a
no
a
imaginary
review.
numbers, though.
Our episodes come out every 2 weeks on a Tuesday. We'd love to hear your feedback and any of your thoughts about what's going on out there in analytics and economics. Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.